Hello, and thank you for joining me today for the Vision of Veritas. I've been putting this off for the last couple days because I haven't had time to really dive into it, but I came across an MSNBC clip that was on The Morning Joe, and it has to do with Fetterman, and obviously MSNBC trying to peddle everything Fetterman's selling even though he is completely unqualified. Let's go ahead and take a look at the interview here, hear what Fetterman has to say, and then break it down. Because quite honestly, I'm willing to give anybody a fair shake until they start lying, or they start saying something completely nonsensical, or have extremely bad policies that they're trying to push through.
Our next guest, John Fetterman, was in a hospital bed recovering from a stroke when he woke up just long enough to hear that he had just won Pennsylvania's Democratic primary for United States Senate on May 17th. And then he immediately fell back to sleep.
I always thought I was pretty empathetic, emphatic. I think I was very, empathetic. That's an example of the stroke, empathetic. I always thought I was very empathetic before having a stroke. But now after having that stroke, I really understand, much more kind of the challenges that Americans have day in and day out.
First and foremost, how does having a stroke now make you more understanding or have better understanding with regards to the plight of everyday Americans? That really doesn't make any sense. This man was brought up with a silver spoon in his mouth. He's never had a job. From my understanding, he's had just about everything handed to him. How could he possibly, in any way, shape, or form, understand the plight of normal Americans both before and after his stroke here? The vast majority of Americans have to work and scrape together everything that they have to, at least in today's economy, to make rent, to make a house payment, to put food on the table. This man hasn't had to do any of this. He's lived off the back of his family for his entire life. The man didn't even buy his Pennsylvania house. It was given to him for a freaking dollar. And this man is sitting here telling you that he can relate to Americans, let alone the everyday Pennsylvanian, when he hasn't worked to achieve a single thing in his entire life, at least not that we know. At least Oz built a business. I may not completely like everything about Oz, but at least Oz is self-made. Oz wasn't handed the keys to a kingdom. He built his kingdom and now owns the keys to it. While he may not live in Pennsylvania, while Fetterman here may be jealous that he doesn't have a half a dozen homes like Oz apparently doesn't make him out of touch with Pennsylvanians. What it does is it makes Fetterman out of touch with what it takes to get ahead in society. It makes Fetterman out of touch with what it takes to start with nothing and gain something from it. That, in and of itself, makes Oz more qualified than Fetterman. Oz runs a business. Oz owns real estate. Oz owns homes. They weren't handed to him. He had to purchase them due to an empire that he built. Fetterman has built absolutely nothing. He has done nothing. And quite honestly, I don't think Fetterman is jealous of Oz because he owns a few homes. I think he's jealous of Oz because he made the money to own said homes. I mean, why the heck else would he keep bringing up the fact that Oz owns a bunch of homes? That doesn't make Oz out of touch with the American people. That makes Oz in tune with the American dream. He worked for what he has. There's a point of pride to that. That's a point of pride that Fetterman will never have unless he does something. Fetterman likes to bring up Oz's wealth and the homes that he owns to suggest that he's out of touch with Americans and Pennsylvanians simply because he doesn't live in Pennsylvania. And again, I would argue that that's completely false. I would argue that a man, regardless of where he lives within the United States, is more in touch with the American people, with Pennsylvanians even, who built his business, who owns his homes because of the money that he has made, is more in touch with everyday Americans than is a man who has had everything handed to him his entire life. He was born with a silver spoon in his mouth.
Franklin Delano Roosevelt was a spoiled rich kid whose cousin was president of the United States when Franklin Roosevelt was a Harvard student. Franklin Roosevelt went on to become the most empathetic politician of his era only after he was struck down by polio at age 39, which left him in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. He won 2 campaigns for governor of New York in that wheelchair, and he won 4 campaigns for president in that wheelchair. Yes, kids, there once was a president who was elected 4 times in a row in a wheelchair. Franklin Roosevelt brought the country out of the worst economic depression in our history in that wheelchair, and he went on to win World War II in that wheelchair.
You can see the utter desperation here because they're now trying to equate Fetterman to FDR. First and foremost, for those of you who actually study history, know that FDR isn't all he was cracked up to be. I really have to bite my tongue here because once I start on FDR, I'm going to go into a whole history lesson and it's going to take quite a lot of time. And you know what? I'll put that in another video down the road. But a really, really short, condensed version here is, as I said earlier, FDR is not all he's cracked up to be. And in fact, it's because of him that the Depression lasted as long as it did. He didn't bring America out of the Depression. He lengthened it due to his policies, due to socialist policies, quite honestly. You know, most people don't know that FDR was actually praised by overseas dictators. But again, that's a video for another time here. The only valid comparison between FDR and Fetterman is they both champion policies that extend current economic woes.
Joining us now is Pennsylvania Lieutenant Governor John Fetterman. He is the Democratic candidate for Senate in the state of Pennsylvania. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. I want to ask you a first question about an issue that has become very prominent in these final weeks of the campaign, and that is crime in Pennsylvania. And I want to put the question to you in the form of a Pennsylvania voter. And what that voter said to the New York Times the other day. This is a 66-year-old man who's quoted by the Times saying, "I definitely don't want Fetterman in there. He's too much pro-crime." What would you tell that voter?
I'm absolutely not pro-crime. I'm actually a Democrat that I'm running on my record on crime because Dr. Oz has never done a single thing about fighting crime. You know, as mayor in Braddock for four terms as mayor in a community that had significant gun violence here, I ran to be a mayor to fight it. And as a result, we stopped the killings. For 5.5 years, we stopped it.
You know, I'm not entirely sure what makes Fetterman think that he did anything for crime here in Pennsylvania, let alone in Braddock. I mean, for those of you who don't know, Braddock is one of the most violent places in Pennsylvania. I mean, it's really bad there. I mean, what Fetterman is saying here is completely nonsensical. According to the publicly available data from the FBI, crime actually skyrocketed in Braddock while Fetterman was mayor. And in 2019, the first year in over a decade that Fetterman wasn't mayor, Braddock's crime actually dropped by 61%. If you actually look at official FBI data, during Fetterman's time as mayor between 2006 and 2018, he oversaw crime surging as well as a declining population, despite repeatedly promising to attract new residents, new businesses, and revitalize the area. I mean, what business in the right mind would go up in an area like that? Data from the FBI, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, shows violent crime specifically began spiking between 2013 and 2018. In 2017, violent crime peaked as the number of reports to local police quadrupled compared to 2006. I don't know what fantasy land Fetterman's living in here, but he's out of his freaking mind. Robberies in the area surged in 2017 along with property crimes, burglaries, larceny, theft, and motorcycle vehicle theft. In fact, all property crimes as a whole saw a surge between 2017 and 2019. And that's just what was reported. Braddock here is a local cesspool. You want this man as a representative for our state? Are you out of your freaking mind?
And whereas Dr. Oz has never done a single thing against crime, living in a gated mansion in New Jersey. You know, I run on my record on crime, and I would challenge Dr. Oz to have any record other than just empty words.
You're saying that Oz has never done a single thing to stop crime? Well, you know what? Yeah, I'll grant that to you. The man hasn't been governor or mayor or anything. He doesn't have a record to run on, whereas you have your record to run on, and it's abysmal. Putting aside the whole political parties here, if one was running strictly on a record or lack thereof, anybody looking into the facts would never choose you. You have an absolutely abysmal record on crime. Crimes actually surged under your mayorship. You took a town that was being run into the ground and you drove it into the ground faster. At least Oz has built something and could have a chance at turning something around. If you're running on the record, yours is the worst to run on.
What would you want to do in the United States Senate on the issue of crime?
Well, I think it's simply having the understanding of enacting gun reform laws as well.
Okay, so when he's asked specifically what he wants to do in the United States with regards to crime, the first thing he mentions is gun reform. Now, putting aside the fact that he probably doesn't know what the Second Amendment is, let alone what it says, simply by stating that he wants to enact gun reform is telling you he wants to violate the Second Amendment. He wants to violate your Second Amendment rights. The last time I checked, the last phrase in the Second Amendment is "shall not be infringed." There was a specific and valid reason for that phrase. That's why it exists, and that's why it's still there. Enacting gun reform, that's a polite way of saying gun control. And anybody who knows, studies, understands, knows our history, knows our founding, that has looked into the Federalist Papers, knows that gun reform, which translates into gun control, is a violation of your Second Amendment rights. Putting a less aggressive tone on something doesn't take away from its actual meaning. Make no mistake, folks, gun reform is gun control. Gun control is unconstitutional.
We also understand that Dr. Oz would oppose any of that.
Good. I'm glad to hear that Dr. Oz would oppose that. Dr. Oz should oppose that. Coming from a place like New Jersey, where they have over-the-top and extreme gun control, extreme violation of your Second Amendment rights, he should never be for any kind of gun control. As I've said before, and I'll state it again, it's a violation of your Second Amendment rights. And as a senator, you are charged with upholding the Constitution, not eviscerating it, not making up your own laws, not coming up with your own ideas based on how it makes you feel. You are charged with upholding the Constitution of the United States and the Constitution for the state with which you would represent as a senator.
Once again, you can't really advocate for Pennsylvania if you don't live in Pennsylvania. I think it's really critical that we also have to get the guns off the street, and Dr. Oz would absolutely never be a part of that solution.
Of course you can be an advocate for Pennsylvania if you don't live in Pennsylvania. You don't have to be an individual who is hurting to understand that they're hurting. You don't have to be the individual in trouble to see that they're in trouble. I don't have to live in a specific state to see that there are issues that need fixing in another state. I don't need to live in a specific area to say, hey, you know what? I can do good in this area. Now, I will say this, it is preferred that the individual live in the state with which they represent, but it's not required. And in this case, the individual who is out of state is astronomically better than the individual who is in state. Ultimately, you are elected to represent your constituents. As long as you are representing your constituents and not only upholding the Constitution of the United States, but the Constitution of Pennsylvania, you are performing the job with which you set out to do. And that inherently already makes Oz more qualified because he hasn't stated that he would violate your Second Amendment rights.
If you become a member of the Senate, would you vote to end the filibuster rule, the 60-vote threshold in the Senate?
Absolutely. In fact, to my knowledge, I was the first candidate to actually call for eliminating the filibuster because we understood that if you want to have anything accomplished here in the Senate, we're going to need to drop that, particularly in common sense, gun reform.
Trying to eliminate the filibuster would be a piss-poor decision. Furthermore, let's say you actually did eliminate the filibuster. Everyone knows that down the road, once you need it again, you're just going to try to enact it or enable it again. You can't have it both ways. At least you're not supposed to be able to have it both ways. The filibuster exists for a reason. And the reason why you want to dismantle it is because it's doing what it was designed to do. It's keeping a simple majority from voting along party lines to enact unconstitutional legislation. Currently, in our country's state, we need the filibuster. In our socio-political climate, with which our two parties are more divided and more extreme than ever in recent history, the filibuster is the only thing left to protect citizens from radical change, from unconstitutional change. A 60-vote threshold ensures that there is at least some measure of compromise that has to be reached. Although recently, like in the case of Nancy Pelosi, she's using it to make backroom deals and pay off Republican senators so she can effect the change that she wants. Rhinos are at fault for accepting the bribes, and she's at fault for making them. It also ensures the fundamental principle of our three branches of government. It ensures separation of powers. It ensures that there is a chance that if there is a ruling majority in two or more houses, that it is possible for unconstitutional legislation to not be rammed through, or legislation that is beholden to one party and one party alone not to be rammed through. The filibuster, at least right now, is absolutely vital. And I'm just going to state for the record, this works both ways. If the Republicans hold at least 2 majorities in 2 houses, the filibuster exists. If the Democrats hold 2 or more majorities in 2 houses, the filibuster exists. It should not be dismantled so one specific political party, in this case, the left Democrat Marxist political party, it exists so that party cannot ram through unconstitutional legislation.
Also, in terms of action in the Senate, would you support Senate legislation to basically write Roe versus Wade into law?
Absolutely. Codifying Roe v. Wade, I run on that as well, too. Dr. Oz celebrated when Roe v. Wade went down. He runs with Doug Mastriano, and they both have these very extremist views on abortion. You know, Dr. Oz believes that the choice belongs with him, where I believe that the choice belongs with women.
While I'm not going to get too deeply into Roe versus Wade here, I'm going to state this. It's not every day that you see a federal government give up some of its own power. That's what it did by knocking Roe versus Wade back to the states where it belongs, where it historically was, actually. You know, you leftists like to say that Roe versus Wade was destroyed, that it was gotten rid of, that all abortion is criminalized, and if you try to get an abortion, you're going to go to jail. And that's total bull. It's not true at all whatsoever. The only thing the Supreme Court did was move or push Roe versus Wade back to the states, which is constitutional. I'm not talking about the morality or lack thereof of what Roe versus Wade stands for. That's not the issue here. The issue is its constitutionality and where its places and on which level it should be on. Historically speaking, it was never on the federal level until Roe versus Wade was enacted, which even Ruth Bader Ginsburg said was terrible legislation. She said herself that it would never hold up indefinitely and that it would be torn down because it is terrible legislation. You guys seem to forget that whenever you're making your arguments for it. How convenient. She was actually referring to it on a constitutional level, which is why she said it was bad legislation. The foundational arguments with which it was made, with which Roe versus Wade was decided, was very shaky, was very rocky, and it had never been done before. That is why she said that it would be dismantled at some point in time. And subsequently, it was. It was put back with the states where it not only belongs, but historically was. Despite what you may think, there is no right to an abortion. Despite what you may think, it's not an inherent right that was affirmed at the federal level. And while there are many reasons for that, I'm not going to get into it. But suffice it to say, it historically always was at the state level. And that's where it should remain. If for no other reason than a purely historical and constitutional basis, which is what our representatives are supposed to be advocating for, not the latest Marxist agenda.
And between there and a real doctor, not a fraud like Dr. Oz. It's something that I'm running on, and it's definitely energized and angered a lot of people in Pennsylvania too.
Just as a side note, I'd love to hear why Fetterman says that Dr. Oz is a fraud. Better yet, I'd love to hear him actually try to explain why he's a fraud. Chances are that's not going to happen at any point in time ever. While there is more to this interview, it's, for the most part, it's more of the same, and it's going to be me saying the same stuff, only in a different way. So the next time you're told that Fetterman is great, Fetterman can run on his record, that Fetterman took one of the most crime-ridden cities in Pennsylvania and brought the crime down, just point them to this video, and then point them to the FBI statistics, because the idea that he did anything of what he's saying is complete bull. The evidence is quite clear, and it's right there for you to see, for everybody to see. The problem is people believe whatever they're told. They were never taught how to think for themselves, how to discover things, how to research. And therefore they believe everything like a mindless lemming. And that's exactly what the Democrat Party wants you to be, a mindless lemming. If you actually looked up this information for yourself, you would see that it's an outright fabrication, it's a lie. But as I said, you're simply going to believe whatever you're told because that's what you have been trained to do. Anyhow, thank you for joining me today for another look at the truth here on the Vision of Veritas channel. If you learned anything, if you got anything out of today's episode, please like, share, and subscribe. I'm still a brand new channel here, and I cannot further this without you. Thank you, my friends. Take care, and Pennsylvania voters, choose wisely. I know we say this a lot, but it is more true this year than in any other year, at least in my lifetime. But you are on the cusp of one of the most important elections potentially in your lifetime.